Hello and welcome to the course Social Behavior and the Brain, an Introduction to Social Neuroscience. I am Dr. Ark Verma, an Associate Professor at the Department of Cognitive Science, IIT Kanpur. This is the second week of the course and we are still continuing to understand the ideas about understanding and representing of self and others in the brain. This lecture will continue from last lecture number 5, where we were talking about direct processing of self and other, and we were discussing a bunch of neuroimaging studies which had been synthesized into a meta-analysis by Zaki and Oshner. Now, in this part of this lecture, we are going to talk about the analysis of reflective processing of the self and the other. Now, we were able to so far review the patterns of processing of the self and other when the participants of this experiment had engaged in the direct mode of processing. Now, the dissociations that were observed thereby could possibly be attributed to the differential recruitment of the systems important for processing the sensory information available for direct personal experience as compared to the indirect observations of others. Now, remember, we had contrasted direct processing and reflective processing earlier in the previous week as well in lectures 4 and 5, if I remember correctly. Now, just before we sort of go into this, you should remember, when we are talking about direct processing, we are talking about processing which is more autonomic, and it is quick, and it is basically more physiologically driven. And when we are talking about reflective processing, we are talking more in terms of deliberative processing of the stimuli, which also allows us to basically consider the outcome of these autonomic systems and sort of moderate them or regulate them as per the need be. Now, let us move on to examine the reflective processing for self and other. As regards emotion, now the authors of this meta-analysis plotted the activation peaks from the studies on reflective processing, and they constrained their plots to display the results of the main contrast requiring explicit judgment of affective states. So, you can see, if you remember the quadrant that we had drawn, there are two factors, direct processing and reflective processing, and then there are the other two factors, targets, cell processing and other processing, and there are a bunch of these decisions that these participants have to make. In this set of analyses, what we are going to look at is direct processing of affective states, where people have been required to explicitly judge the affective states of the targets. Now, this category that we call reflective self included any contrasts in which the participants were asked to either rate their own experiences while viewing emotional stimuli, and the reflective other category included contrast wherein the participants were asked to rate the emotional state of someone else in a picture, a vignette or a cartoon. Now, why is this reflective self including the areas where the participants are asked to rate their experiences rather than just observing the first emotional response that the brain is showing in response to these stimuli? Remember, we are talking about reflective processing, and what do we do in reflective processing? We are basically giving the individual time to deliberate upon whatever experiences he or she is having, and also when you allow them to rate their own experiences, you are giving them time to sort of understand and experience these emotions in a little bit more detail, and also while or just before giving the rating response, there would probably be a degree of moderation where the participants are consciously considering the degree of emotion they are feeling in response to these stimulations. So, reflective self therefore will include all of those studies which had asked participants to view emotional pictures and then reflect upon what they are feeling when they are watching these pictures. Remember, this takes away the direct processing component and allows us to examine activity which is happening in a more deliberative sense, in a more conscious, aware sense, and it is not autonomic or physiological to that degree. Remember, direct processing and reflective processing have a contrast. Direct processing happens autonomically, whereas reflective processing sort of evaluates the autonomic response to these visual stimuli. Okay. So, also the authors included both contrast comparing the judgment to no judgment and contrast comparing affective judgments to judgments about the external stimulus which were not affective. What are affective judgments? When you are asking the participant to explicitly rate or evaluate the emotion that they are observing in a set of stimuli, let us say pictures or let us say faces. Oh, this face you are seeing, is it a happy face, is it a sad face, is it a disgusted face? Or for example, you might be aware of the IAPS database, where there are affective pictures also rated for valence and arousal. So what you are asking is, we are asking the participants to go through these pictures and basically rate their arousal or their, you know, the valence of emotion that they are feeling. So there are two kinds of judgment that they have included. First is when they are actually explicitly asked to judge or rate versus when they are not asked to judge. So these are the two contrasts, and the other two contrasts is affective judgment versus non-affective judgment. So for example, what is the emotional state that you are feeling at any point in time, or just you know, decision about, you know, tell the gender of the you know, face that we are showing you. So this way what we will get is, we will get a very good contrast about how does reflective processing of emotions occur in these variety of circumstances that the authors have tried to capture here. Also, moving forward, the authors were interested in investigating the interaction between qualitatively different types of reflections about others. For example, when they plotted the reflective other studies, wherein participants made non-emotional mental state judgments about others in vignettes, pictures and cartoons, separately from where participants made judgments about their enduring personality traits of their targets. So remember, a bunch of these studies actually use face stimuli, and when you are you know, looking at face stimuli, there is a bunch of computations possible, there is a bunch of evaluations that are possible that you can do at your own end. So for this next set of analysis, when the participants were asked to make judgments about sometimes also the non-emotional mental states about the other individuals. So you're basically asking, let's say, you know, the gender question, or you're asking, say for example, whether this is a good person or a bad person, those kind of things. So these are non-emotional judgments. So you're not judging or estimating their emotional states in others, but you're basically asking them about other characteristics which are not in this affective you know, zone. Also, sometimes participants were asked to make personality trait judgments about these targets. Say for example, is this guy going to be a punctual guy, is it you know, a conscientious guy, and things like that. So at this point, if you see here, not only the emotional state is being evaluated, but these tasks seem to have a component of the theory of mind task. Remember, theory of mind task involve judgment of others' mental states and computation that go along with them. So these are some of the analysis that these authors sort of wanted to do. Now let's look at the results more closely. Reflective emotional processing showed several regions of overlap for both self targets and the other targets. What are these regions where we found this overlap? We found the overlap in the areas in the precuneus and the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, the bilateral temporal poles, and the medial orbitofrontal cortex. So these are the regions which showed overlap for both self targets and other targets when the participants were reflectively processing emotional state. So when they were given time to rate the emotional states of others, or when they were given time to reflect on the emotional states or rate the emotional states of themselves. All right, and this is interesting because, as I was just saying, these regions have also been thought to be responsible for the mental state attribution in general. Remember the last point that I was mentioning, sometimes these participants were making non-emotional judgments as well. Sometimes they were basically trying to you know, estimate the personality traits of these individuals as well, and therefore activation in these areas should not be very surprising for us. But let's go ahead and see. So it seems that these regions that are involved in mental state or attribution are also co-involved in emotion comprehension as well. So technically what we are seeing is, given the type of contrast that the authors have studied, you are basically seeing two kinds of regions you know, showing activations here, and also regions that are involved in theory of mind tasks or mental state attribution tasks, as well as emotion comprehension tasks. Now also, activity in the numerous subregions of the medial prefrontal cortex, including anterior and ventral portions, also follows that this medial prefrontal cortex is a central region to both kinds of inferences. Inferences about mental states and also inferences about emotional experiences. So the medial prefrontal cortex seems to be a very critical area which is actually involved also in the theory of mind tasks, but also in the you know, comprehension of the emotional state tasks. Now moving on, the participants also observed activity in two additional overlap regions, the precuneus and the PCC. Okay, So let's look in more detail. So it must be noted that this activity in the precuneus has also been often related to both visuospatial imagery and self-focused attention, and also visual perspective taking in a first person or a third person point of view. Now remember, what we are doing here is we are basically saying, okay, when we put these kinds of contrasts together, when we are evaluating participants' neural activity, given that contingent on the type of judgments that we are asking them to do, these different regions are lighting up. Which are these regions? The precuneus and the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, the bilateral temporal poles, and the medial OFC. Now the next thing that we are doing is we are trying to see or trying to reason why each of these regions, or to what extent each of these regions must be involved in this judgment of emotional states of others, or let's say the other kind of judgments that we are evaluating here. So the precuneus seems to be linked to visuospatial imagery as well, and self-focused attention. And also interestingly, it is found to be implicated where perspective taking is observed both in the first person. Say for example, how do I see let's say the person in front of me, what they are feeling, how do I rate that, or how do I sort of as a third person observe my own affective state. So as third person perspective and first person perspective, in both these cases the precuneus is supposed to be activated. Now, while the precuneus does not seem to have any connections with any other sensory cortices, it is connected with the superior temporal sulcus and the anterior cingulate cortex, and therefore it seems that the precuneus may be involved in directing attentional resources to salient social or emotional stimuli that would allow the individual basically making decisions about the first person or third person perspective, self-focused attention, and visuospatial imagery. Now, in the same way, the precuneus or the posterior cingulate cortex is often involved in self-referential mental and emotional tasks. While it has been suggested that the PCC may play a part in the ventral emotional stream, sending information about potentially salient stimuli to the ventral anterior cingulate cortex through direct reciprocal connections. So you can see here something that sort of comes out very interestingly here is the activity that is observed in different areas of the brain is very contingent to the type of task that you are asking the brain to do. It is very sensitive to the task demands. So, and also the activity is not exclusively localized or exclusively tied to a specific type of task. Now, this is something very interesting, and this is something very important for all students of neuroscience to remember, that when we find activations in specific brain areas to be involved, and when the participant is involved in a particular kind of task, it does not mean that that region, let's say region A linked to activity X, it does not mean that that region A is exclusively tied to activity X. It may mean on the other hand that region A obviously mediates task activity X, but it must be mediating other kinds of activities, say for example activities Y, Z, A, B, C, N also. So this is again something that we have to keep in mind when we are interpreting the results of this meta-analysis. Now, put together, common activation in these regions suggests that perceivers use similar mechanisms for self-perception and other perception to direct attentional resources to emotional cues. Again, just keeping it together, there is obviously a certain degree of overlap, the areas that we mentioned moments ago, for both self-perception and other perception, wherein the individual is required or individual needs to direct their attentional resources to emotional cues and gather more and more information from there. And this happens in both cases. It happens when you are looking at self-related targets, also happens when you are looking at other related targets. Now, going forward, there was also a degree of dissociation observed. So, let us look at where. Dissociation between activity associated with reflective judgments of self and other was relatively subtler than the analogous differences described in the context of direct emotion processing. So, remember, in direct emotion processing we found a certain degree of overlap, but we also found a relatively large degree of dissociations as well. But here, when you are looking at reflective processing of self targets and other targets, the dissociations are slightly mild. They are not as highlighted, they are not as magnified as we had seen in the context of direct emotion processing. Also remember, these differences were not very reliable, and since these differences are maybe slightly less reliable, it may tempt us to sort of brush them under the carpet and not pay attention to them, and this is where the authors say that they are indeed deserving of attention, and obviously future research should look into these specific areas and find out create experimental designs to unpack the functional significance of these areas. Let us look at this. So, to summarize, the reflective judgments of other people's emotions were found to more commonly recruit extrastriate and medial occipital cortices, which is consistent with the fact that these tasks involve explicit attention to people, mostly in visual scenes. So, again, depending on the kind of stimuli the participants were seeing in the studies that are aggregated over here, broadly it can be said, or summarily it can be said, that when participants were engaged in reflective judgments of other people's emotions, the areas more commonly recruited or involved in these decisions were the extrastriate and the medial occipital cortices, which is probably because that these areas are also involved in paying explicit attention to people and stimuli. Also, where self-related judgments mainly involved inferior frontal regions, other related judgments involved mainly lateral orbitofrontal regions. So, here is the subtle dissociation that we see in participants viewing the self target or the other target in the reflective mode of processing that we are observing at this point. Now, these two regions that I mentioned, as these regions are associated with response selection and inhibition, it is there that their response that they may be playing precise computational roles, and it sort of seems to be a very interesting topic of debate. Okay. So, the most interesting features of these plots is the commonality of activity regardless of the target of perception, in contrast to the pattern observed for the direct mode of processing. So, in the direct mode of processing, we actually looked at the overlapping areas and the dissociated areas together, and we saw that there was a degree of significance to both, but here it seems, given the the dissociations are relatively subtle, it seems most interesting to look at the common activity or the overlapping activity in regions of the brain when the participants are observing either the self or the other as targets. So, we can conclude from the same that when the self or someone else is viewed as an object of reflection, a network of region comes into play that is involved in directing attention, interpreting social cues and inferring internal states. Just pay attention to this. What are we saying? When the self or even somebody else, the target is other, is viewed as an object of reflection. What do I mean by object of reflection? You are basically saying that you are observing, you are evaluating, you are considering either your own mental state, basically measuring it against the contextual appropriateness, the situation that you are in, the kind of people that are surrounding you and so on. And it basically is a multi-layered, multifaceted task. So, it basically network of regions would come into play that is involved in directing attention, because you can gather cues from the environment. Interpreting social cues is very important. So, for example, who are the people that you are surrounded with, what is the situation, what is the time, is it appropriate time to, let's say, blurt out your anger or shower your emotions, or you would sort of want to exercise some restraint and basically restrain yourself for a later time. So, directing attention, gathering social cues, interpreting social cues and also inferring the internal states of the agents. Remember, in the previous lecture we were talking about emotional regulation, and we said that a very important function or a very important aspect of comprehending emotions is also linked to inferring the internal states of others. Basically, if the example that I gave in the previous class, if you are hit by somebody just by walking, or you bang into somebody else, obviously the first response will be of disappointment and anger, but suppose you can immediately gather that this was by mistake and neither the party were at fault, then you have to sort of moderate your response with that knowledge. On the other hand, here, in the absence of reflective processing, the direct and the bottom-up perception of emotion from low-level cues recruits slightly different systems depending upon the type of perceptual input associated with each target. So, something that I was just saying, in reflective processing, a slightly different network of regions is getting activated, and in direct processing, we see that a different set of regions are getting activated. Regions which have more to do with the lower level cues, regions which have more to do with the visceral activation or a visceral feeling for self, and slightly visual cue based for others. So far what we have seen is an interesting contrast that depending upon the mode of processing that the participants are asked to engage in, depending upon the target, depending upon the nature of the stimulus, depending upon the exact task that the people are asked to do, the areas of the brain that will get involved will vary subtly. Okay, it does not mean that, say for example, the medial prefrontal cortex is found to be involved in several of these tasks in different variations. So it does not mean that the core areas will become different, but the degree to which the network of the brain regions gets recruited and gets moderated will obviously vary depending upon the exact kind of task, the exact demands of the task that are placed on the individuals. Moving on, the reflective mode of processing allows us to attend to and elaborate upon our judgments about ourselves and about other people. Okay. So, the same could be done either by thinking about how someone else is feeling as compared to what they are thinking about, and such differences in focus might involve different underlying neural circuitry. Now, what does this point mean? This basically means that if you're sort of considering about somebody else, if you're trying to make sense of, let's say while you wake up in the morning, you're rushing towards school, you bang into somebody, they get hurt, and you sort of are yourself in some hurry and you get out of there. Now, if you at a later point in time take some time out to think about that individual, you can do it by two ways. You can either think of you can either go through the empathy route, trying to understand what this other person might be feeling because of this mishap. Maybe the person got hurt, maybe they broke something, things like that. Or what basically you can say, oh, what this person might be thinking about me, or what is this person thinking, what are his mental states, what are his intentions, and so on. So, two things. One is the evaluation of their affective state, and the other is the evaluation of their intentions and thought processes. And based on what you exactly want to focus upon, the neural circuitry that will be employed by your brain will be actually different. So, again, remember, what we are doing is, what we are studying is social cognitive neuroscience. And remember, in the first lecture of this, or first or second lecture, we discussed in detail that social cognitive neuroscience is empowered by something called the power of situation. It is empowered by this principle of observing the context in great detail, of observing the players in great detail, observing the situations in great detail, because the results are actually interpreted against the background of these things. The results are not interpreted in isolation. You show a stimulus and a region of the brain lights up, the results are not straightforwardly interpreted. The results will be interpreted in the light of what is it that you have been asked to do about the stimulus, what is the situation, what mode of processing does this particular task engage, and that is what we are seeing here. So, to tease apart the different neural mechanisms that are involved in the different ways of thinking about the others, remember, either you are examining their affective state or you are trying to examine their mental states and intentions and so on. These authors, they examine the activations related to emotional and non-emotional mental state judgments about others. So, remember, there are these tasks in moral cognition. They are used false belief task, where, say for example, there are two players, one of them has to judge is sort of made to believe something else about the other one, and they basically then have to estimate what this other person is thinking. So, two kinds of judgments are contrasted. First is emotional mental state judgment, and the other is non-emotional mental state judgment. When they did this analysis demonstrated dissociation in the brain regions recruited by cognitive as opposed to affective inferences about other people. Cognitive inferences are mental state inferences, intentional inferences, attributions of this kind. Affective inferences are how simply what these people might be feeling. Are they feeling happy? Are they feeling sad? Are they feeling annoyed? What is it that they are feeling at that point in time? So, this you can liken a bit more to empathy, whereas this other kind of task you can liken more to the theory of mind kind of tasks that are there. Now, when the participants are asked to get involved in cognitive judgments, so the cognitive judgments more commonly are found to recruit the bilateral temporal parietal junction and frontal eye fields, whereas when they are asked to engage in affective judgments about others, the affective judgments more commonly recruited the orbital frontal cortices and the anterior and ventromedial prefrontal cortex regions. So, you can see here is a very nice dissociation based upon what is it that you're trying to infer about this other target person. Maybe you're watching a scene, maybe you're watching a cartoon, maybe you're watching a face, but it depends on the kind of decision that you want to take about them. If you want to make a cognitive judgment, then a slightly different region is getting activated. If you are making an affective judgment, then again a slightly different region is getting activated or recruited by the brain. Okay. In more detail, the temporoparietal junction is associated with mental state judgments and shifting attention towards behaviorally relevant stimuli in external cueing tasks. So, this is again something else that the temporoparietal junction does. The frontal eye fields is found to be engaged during tasks that require increased attention and working memory for visuospatial stimuli, including when one is attempting to inhibit reflexive tendencies to shift one's eyes towards a visual stimulus. So, this frontal eye fields area is basically involved in working memory and executive function tasks. You know, when you are trying to inhibit something, select a particular response, manage a particular natural response tendency and so on, whereas the temporoparietal junction is very interestingly implicated in mental state judgments and also orienting or shifting of attention. When you put together, when you sort of observe the kind of activations we are seeing in these regions, and when you are using that to draw inferences about cognitive but not affective states, this could suggest us that the cognitive inferences depend to a greater extent on the mental manipulation of the information about stimuli in the external world. So, it basically tells us that working memory and other executive functions, other executive capabilities come into play when you are trying to make cognitive judgments about the other. Remember, a lot of us play or probably play cards, or a lot of us engage in some kinds of gamble. Even say, for example, when you're watching a quiz show and the host sort of is playing with you, the host maybe knows the answer, you are asked to choose an answer and you're sort of thinking, oh, this is correct, this is correct, and a lot of times you're trying to pick up the answer from observing the the host or the game master's facial expression, body language and so on. So, when you are making cognitive judgments, then it seems that a degree of working memory and executive functional resources, which is also sort of supported by the activation of the temporoparietal junction and the frontal eye fields, seems to be involved in this activity. And this is again what naturally brings us to these theory of mind tasks. And remember, theory of mind tasks or theory of mind as a mental function heavily relies on executive functional capabilities and especially on inhibitory control, and the two executive function abilities and the inhibitory control abilities actually are supposed to develop in parallel. When our own perspectives and someone else's perspective differ, making accurate judgments about their mental states requires us to adjust from our own state, and this process is attentionally demanding. So, you have to make some adjustments, you have to make some compromises, and it basically is a very attentionally demanding task. It is a task that requires you to sort of sometimes inhibit your natural response, take into account that, oh, this person is my teammate, he is trying to take this decision, I am sure the decision is in the interest of let us say the group or the both of us. So, you are going through these relatively complicated calculations, and that is why the abilities that are together known as executive function abilities or the the working memory, which is used for manipulation of information in a real time scale, both sort of get involved and both get included in these kind of judgments. And this is where the activations of the frontal eye fields and the temporoparietal junction during mental state inference may reflect the unique attentional demands of keeping multiple mental states in the mind simultaneously. So, what we are saying is, or what the authors are saying is, that these regions are probably activated because they are involved in these computations, they are involved in the if but sort of scenario, they are involved with in counterfactuals and making all of these judgments together. Also, the interesting engagement of the orbitofrontal cortex and the related ventral medial prefrontal cortex regions when people are drawing affective inferences could be related to the role these regions play in representing the motivational value of the stimuli. How badly you want them, is it a is it an approach stimulus or is it an avoidance stimulus, is the picture in question, stimuli in question is inviting, it is laden with the positive valence or laden with negative valence. All of these kind of judgments seem to involve the orbitofrontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex because these regions are good and these regions have been prior indicated to be involved in the evaluation of the motivational value of stimuli. Okay, and there are different kinds of tasks which sort of give us this information. So single cell recordings, lesion studies, fMRI studies of conditioning and reinforcement learning have already told us that this orbitofrontal cortex and the ventral ventromedial prefrontal cortex is basically involved, is supposed to be useful in representing the current motivational or affective value of stimuli as it changes over time as a function of one's goals. So for example, at a point in time when you're just on a vacation and you sort of want to let your hair down and enjoy, then a bowl or a mug or a tub of ice cream seems very inviting. It seems very in sync with your goals, because you're out there, you're going to have a vacation. But on the other hand, let's say if you are on some kind of a diet, if you want to sort of restrain, then obviously if pictures of great food, pictures of ice creams for that matter, will not seem very appealing, will not seem very inviting to you. Rather, if you sort of control yourself to a certain degree, they may seem repelling as well at certain points in time. Now, this is where the OFC and the VMPFC seem to be involved. Now, other things about this region. So, the OFC also shares strong connections with the hypothalamus, which projects to the brainstem nuclei controlling autonomic outflow, and its activity has been shown to co-vary with skin conductance responses. On the other hand, the amygdala has been thought to encode relatively enduring context-free and stimulus-driven associations between perceptual cues and physiological responses. So here maybe the OFC activity could be interpreted as playing an important role in representing in either one's own or another person's current affective state. So these motivational values, when you're sort of making these effective judgments about stimuli, this is where the OFC seems to be coming into play. Now, this hypothesis could explain the role of the OFC in the perception of emotion in self and another. So this is something that the authors have proposed, and let's try and understand it in more detail. Now, results of a recent study wherein participants were asked to see emotional or neutral pictures and then rate their effect for the subsequent 20 seconds after the pictures disappeared. So you're being shown pictures, and once the pictures are gone, there is a 20 seconds response time window where you are basically asked to rate either how you are feeling or how somebody else is feeling after the pictures have gone. Now, interestingly, after viewing negative pictures, subjects commonly reported feeling sustained emotion even after the picture was gone. So, negative stimuli or negative pictures seem to have that kind of lasting effect, where people are observing or people are feeling this sustained emotion for a slightly longer time even after the pictures have disappeared. The involved regions for this kind of task were the amygdala and the lateral orbitofrontal cortex. Why the amygdala seem to be activated along with the presence of negative affective pictures, negative emotional pictures. So it sort of lights up when you are evaluating a negative stimulus, but the lateral orbitofrontal cortex seem to be engaged, seem to be involved, contingent to the participants' sustained self-reported emotion, where they are probably deliberating or reflecting on what they have just seen. Sometimes these negative pictures, if you look at the IAPS database, you can just go on the internet and you'll find a bunch of those pictures. Sometimes you are obviously caught lingering or caught sort of evaluating those pictures after they have left, and they seem to be at the back of your head, which might be the reason for this sustained emotion experience that these participants are reporting. Also, the orbitofrontal cortex seem to reflect the personal experience and generation of an emotional response to a particular stimulus. And indeed, in the same vein, in this similarly, antisocial and psychopathic patients, as well as those who show lesions to the orbitofrontal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, show attenuated autonomic reactions to expected stressors, as well as in anticipation of unpredictable stressors, suggesting an inability to generate context appropriate affective responses. So you can see here through this example that the OFC seems to be involved when you are reflecting upon the personal experience and then the generation of an emotional response to a particular stimuli. And in individuals where the orbitofrontal cortex is damaged, those individuals seem to be unable to actually show these autonomic reactions. Their reactions are either delayed, out of context, or extremely attenuated, extremely weakened response they show to these kind of emotional stimuli. Also, in other kinds of studies, it has been shown or it has been suggested that the effective representations in the orbitofrontal cortex may help individuals understand the emotions generated in other people as well. So, not only the the generation of an emotional response in ourselves, the orbitofrontal cortex has also been implicated in generating the affective representations that are being generated in other individuals. So, patients who have the OFC damage can sometimes do not understand the social faux pas kind of situations. Say for example, you are happy about somebody winning a particular prize, but when you go, you say something else which is completely counterintuitive. So, for example, you are going to congratulate somebody, they have won a big prize, and you suddenly say, oh, many condolences to yourself. So, while you were actually intending to say congratulations, you by mistake said condolences, and this seems to be a social mistake, because others will try and see how this how this kind of a mistake has happened. Others with normally function OFC will immediately be conscious of that, and they will try to make amends. Patients who have a damaged orbitofrontal cortex are unable to see these things. They seem to be insensitive to a certain degree to what the other people might be feeling. Say for example, these people unknowingly might be bragging too much about their own success, putting people down at their failures, and in that sense create a very socially awkward situation. Obviously, they are not, the inhibition does not seem to be operating nicely, but more importantly, they are not able to feel, they are not able to experience or estimate what is going on in these other people's minds, in their other people's, emotional states. So, as I said, their social interactions could engender either pride or embarrassment in healthy individuals. So, for example, if a healthy individual gets into this kind of mistake in situation, they would either feel embarrassment or pride if something goes correct. And self-conscious emotions like these are important in social interactions, because they inform us about how our own behavior has had an intended or unintended consequence for others. So, if you say correctly, congratulations, I am very happy with your success, it creates the intended effect. On the other hand, if you are saying in a party and somebody is celebrating their success, and you say, oh, many condolences for your loss and something like that, and then it sort of creates a very awkward situation. So, these self-conscious emotions that are being generated by the OFC seem to be extremely important in not only experiencing correctly the context appropriate emotions, but also estimating correctly the context appropriate emotional response given the other individuals involved in this interaction. So, to the extent that damage to the OFC renders us unable to experience these emotions normally, we may become inappropriately boastful or forward or rude. Sometimes people make social advances. You are in a party, you are talking to somebody, you like them, you try to become friends with them, but you also have to be at that same point be very careful and mindful of whether the person is enjoying your company, not enjoying your company, encouraging your advances, not encouraging your advances. So, people with OFC damage do not have these skills, they seem to miss these skills, and therefore a lot of times will be found to be engaged in contextually inappropriate responses, be it either too much pride, too much boastfulness, or even being insensitive towards what others are feeling. All in all, if you try and just wrap this up, comparisons of the patterns of neural activity associated with the reflective mode of processing for self and the other showed much more overlap and fewer differences than did the same comparison for the direct mode of processing. Also, this suggests that when individuals indulge in making explicit judgments about people, perceivers actually tap into a common sense of cognitive and affective process, regardless of whether they are reflecting about themselves or others. Remember, we talked about shared representations, we talked about empathy, we talked about feeling the same that the other person is feeling. And here, if you remember again which things that I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, that regions that are involved in the theory of mind sort of mental function are heavily involved. So, it basically tells us that people tap into this, people do to a certain extent use their own mental states as a template to infer other people's emotions. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. Now, perceivers usually direct their attention to salient cues, they infer internal states, and also create autonomic and emotional states in themselves when they're trying to infer emotions in others, and when inferring false beliefs may use inhibitory control to separate their own point of view from the target. So something that I was just saying, it seems that judgment of emotions seems to involve or tap into this common network of shared representations, wherein then it becomes, on the latter side, becomes very important for us to know this is our perspective and this the other person's perspective. Remember, in the previous lecture we were talking about when people are involved in a fight or in a competitive battle, even though they can feel that same empathy, they need to sort of moderate their empathy until the fight is over and the battle is won. So this is basically something that comes out from this set of studies as well, and from the observation of reflective mode of processing for self and the other as well. Thank you. I'll see you in the next talk.